It could have all been so perfect. A place in history. Was that so much to ask for? Nabokov once said, "Life is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness." And how right he was. The span of a human life is but a fraction of a second in the grand scale of time. It is insignificant to the universe. Since I was a young man, I wanted to be remembered. I wanted my legacy to live hundreds of years after my frail body has rotted into dust. In the past, man has searched in vain for eternal life, the infamous fountain of youth, the philosopher's stone, and all the other elixirs of life. It is the same reason that religion is still so prominent today. No man wishes to accept his own mortality. This was partly why I joined Operation Phoenix, when an old colleague of mine at the university introduced me to some classified documents and suggested that I could put my talents towards assisting them. At first, I scoffed at the idea, but eventually I was drawn in. A pity. If I had listened to the nagging voice in my head that told me to stay away, I wouldn't be sitting here now. And by God, if I could, I would. Maybe then I'd stop seeing their faces at night. Maybe then I'd be able to sleep. I'd be able to say that this vile affair took place in the heart of the Soviet Union, perhaps the deprived laboratories of the Third Reich. I really would. But in truth these experiments were all performed in the rolling fields of Albion, not far from the small village where I grew up. There is a small military base that has long since fallen into disrepair a few miles north of York that doesn't officially exist on any maps, civilian or military. But any who are brave or foolish enough to scale the wire fence and gain access to the dark hallways will find spent cartridges in the corners of the labyrinthine corridors, and scraps of classified papers in heaps of ash in the long-abandoned laboratories. Not much has survived the fire, but a savvy and observant interloper might piece together the story of what happened there. The whole place was torched after the incident to remove any traces of the evidence, blamed on troublesome youths from nearby towns for an arson attack that claimed the lives of almost 100 MOD scientists. If you believe that ignorance is bliss, and that some things are best left buried, then I urge you to put down this note and forget about it. But if you value truth as much as I once did, then read on. Operation Phoenix was a military-funded operation. Looking back, their intentions were all too clear, but I was naive and blind to the project's real goals, which at first made me uneasy. But Richards reassured me it wouldn't be a problem. Shortly after my induction, Commander Huntingley sat me down and explained the project's aims. It seemed the project wasn't quite as far-fetched as I originally thought. Yes, they did speak to find the secrets of immortality, but through surprisingly conventional methods. Rebirth. The Phoenix is a legendary creature that would die and be reborn from the ashes, hence Operation Phoenix. I know it's a terrible name, but our focus was to unlock the secrets of genetic renewal, not waste time thinking of a catchy code name. To put it simply, we were creating a serum to affect the host's genetics. When a cell dies, it is replaced, but as you get old, the cells stop getting replaced. The idea being, if we could unlock the secrets of genetic renewal, the host could live for much longer than his intended lifespan. Think what Einstein or Marx could have accomplished given but another 10 years of life. This project was offering at least triple that. You can see the results of the project in my journal that I enclosed, but let me warn you, it isn't for the faint-hearted. November 22nd, 1982. The first load of test subjects arrived today, and I can barely wait to begin the first trials of the experiment. Imagine the glory we would receive if this project succeeds. My name would ring not just throughout Britain, but throughout the entire world. Batch 1 contains 9 males and 3 females, all between the ages of 20 and 29, all fit and healthy. Inmates of a nearby prison who are given the chance to reduce their sentences by becoming lab rats. The prototype serum has been administered to all subjects, and they have been escorted to the holding areas. The thought of what this experiment could achieve for mankind sends shivers down my spine. December 2nd, 1982. No major changes have been seen in any of the test subjects bar 1. Patient M4 has developed extreme abnormal aggression. This morning a guard caught him savaging female patient 2. The guard attempted to restrain him, but M4 mauled him and escaped. F2 received heavy but treatable wounds to the neck, abdomen and face during the ordeal. A shame. She was a pretty girl. Male 4 was eventually brought down whilst attempting to scale the electrified perimeter fence. A guard in a nearby watchtower saw him tangled in razor wire and was forced to terminate him with a bullet to the head. We still don't fully understand why he did it. The patient seemed perfectly cooperative until this point. Perhaps this is a side effect of the serum. Perhaps a result of his isolation. Who can say? A further 2 batches arrived today, with no particularly remarkable patients. December 13th, 1982. Sometimes I wonder if they understood the service they were doing to mankind, whether they would act any differently. They are so passive and distant, barely human. Something about them makes me uncomfortable. The way they shuffle around, never looking you in the eyes. It's like they hardly even notice the world around them. Sometimes I find myself hating them. Don't they understand what effect the serum they're helping to create would have on the course of human history? The serum has been altered, and we administered it to batches 2 and 3. Huntingly wants the first batch to remain pure, a control group, to see if the others are affected similarly to patient M4. But she still shows extreme fatigue and unwillingness to cooperate with the scientists. The 4th and final batch also arrived today, just in time to replace losses. Many subjects are now showing extreme abnormal muscle growth. They're practically skeletal frames struggling to sport so much flesh. On a sadder note, Dr. Lee hung himself today. His knowledge and expertise will be missed. Every scientist lost is at least a setback of a week, maybe more. Many others are abandoning the project, calling it inhumane. Can't they see how much good can be done from doing a little evil? The ends shall justify the means. February 9th, 1983. Of the original 4 dozen, near 2/3 are now dead. Subjects M17, M20, and F8 showed promise, but like the others, they eventually succumbed to cardiogenic shock. It seems their circulatory systems have failed to cope with the addition of the excess muscle growth. Each loss is an extreme frustration to all. The remaining dozen have been isolated in individual cells to prevent any accidents with other patients. Every day, more and more scientists are abandoning their workstations. Their selfishness nearly caused the project to grind to a halt at one point. But once double shifts were implemented, our work continued at a steady pace. The few dozen scientists left, including Richards and myself, have been working frantically to meet the deadline. But it seems our work is in vain. We simply don't have the manpower to complete the project. Curiously, The excess muscle growth is heavily laced with proteins from the serum, and nobody is sure why. Lab reports also suggest it resists being broken down with organic acids. Another mystery. February 10th, 1983. I saw them today. For the first time in weeks. They've changed so much since last time. They are no longer human, merely beasts of sinuous muscle. It made my stomach turn to just be in the same room as them. Their eyes follow you, as if examining you, but they remain motionless, slumped in the corner. Most are only able to make low guttural grunts, which sound almost melancholy. We're still yet to discover why they have lost use of their vocal cords. Perhaps they are merely unwilling to speak. Richards was showing me the results of our experiments conducted earlier in the week when something completely unexpected happened. The patient lumbered up and banged on the reinforced window with all his might. A crack appeared in the thick glass, and we froze in fear. But the patient remained motionless in front of the window, not intent on breaking out as we first worried. It seemed to be more of an act of frustration, or perhaps anger. He simply stood watching us through his dull brown eyes. I took a step towards him, and he turned his head to me. For a moment the room was still, and then something completely ordinary happened. He blinked. It was such a human thing to do. For a moment I was almost surprised. As of that moment, I stopped seeing patient 19 as a hunched, hulking monstrosity and started seeing him as a man. Patient 19, I had read his file, Alexander Harper, age 28, divorced, father of 2 young girls. A former teacher only guilty of a minor tax charge. As I stared into the abomination's eyes, I saw what we had done to these people. We had taken their humanity and turned them into these animals, in our vain pursuit for fame and glory. I choked back tears and left the room, followed by Richards. Why did that bastard have to drag me into this? At that point, all I wanted, more than anything else, was to stop this project. But nothing mattered now. Nothing could change what we had done to poor Alex. February 11th, 1983. We have failed. We have failed to create anything near what we had hoped for. Our funding has been cut and the project disbanded. All the patients are to be terminated. We refused to abandon our work, and for a short while, we thought they had listened to our protests. But Huntingley had contacted his superiors, and within the hour, military trucks were arriving outside. They didn't even attempt to negotiate with us. They just shot on sight. I heard the stutter of a submachine gun and ran around the corner in time to see Cause's white lab coat peppered with bullets as she slumped against the wall and fell to the ground. Richards came hurtling around the corner, his breath ragged and his shirt blackened. "Andrew," he choked out, but before he could say anything else, his chest erupted in a fountain of gore as a submachine gunner opened fire. I did not hesitate. I just turned and ran. Please don't judge me. I was so scared. Scared that they might get me too. I ran from the slaughter, the screams of my dying friends, and the blood. The unbearable blood. A left turn, a right turn, and another left to reach the emergency exit. A pane of reinforced glass shattered behind me in a volley of machine gun fire, sending broken shards scattering across the floor. It was a desperate, undignified scramble for survival, but through sheer dumb luck, I had evaded them. I burst out of the emergency exit and ran into the darkness. I ran and ran and ran, until my legs gave way and I fell to the ground in a heap on the soft white snow. My head was spinning. I just watched the murder of one of my closest friends, the killing of all of my co-workers, and the destruction of all of my research. But all I could see was Alex's face in the darkness of the winter night. Because of me. Oh God, what have I done? Epilogue. In hindsight, it all fits into place. The military didn't care for science. It didn't care for enhancing our short little lives. It didn't even want to create a breed of super soldier as might be suspected. It wanted meat. A cheap, plentiful supply of meat that could be quickly and cheaply grown. Alexander was not a patient. He was fucking livestock. Fears over BSE, mad cow disease to the common man, contaminating military stocks have prompted investigations into finding a new source of protein for our squaddies. They claim the ends justify the means. Sound familiar? Maybe once I would have agreed, but now those words taste bitter in my mouth. But in truth, none of this matters anymore. Soon, the final survivor of the Rayleigh base fire will die, and I will have the mercy of being forgotten. I don't want to be remembered for what I did to those poor wretches. I can't bear the guilt anymore. The only way out is to end it all. To whoever finds this diary, bring it to the public's attention. I want people to know the truth about what we did. I want people to know what depraved things we did to those poor souls, so that no one will ever follow me down the same dark path. I leave you with a proverb, written by those much wiser than I. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. An Abhorrent Vacuum by the Vesper's Bell. The ontological vacuum chamber had been intended to create a pocket of absolute nothing, in the purest philosophical sense of the term. It was to be completely devoid of not only mass and energy, but space and time as well. This would not be like the vacuum of the observable universe, filled with diffused hydrogen and ever frothing with fathom quantum fluctuations. This would be nothing. No caveats, no asterisks. Just the pure, undated absence of being down to the Planck scale. There would be much ado about this nothing, since it would be, by any conceivable metric, the greatest technological advancement in human history. The specifics of how the ontological vacuum chamber worked were highly classified, and most of those with clearance didn't properly understand it themselves. In principle, though, it worked like a normal vacuum chamber, pumping out its contents until there was nothing left. That required, or at least implied, an impressive capacity to manipulate space-time itself, possibly derived from NASA's dabbling experiments in the Alcubierre warp drive concept. And yet, even this would pale in comparison to the engineering that went into the wall of the chamber itself. It was a perfect, flawless sphere, necessary to evenly distribute the pressure of all external reality crushing down on it. It was comprised of some sort of transplanchanian substrate, made out of something smaller than the smallest scale in the universe. As a result, it was completely indestructible. Antimatter couldn't annihilate it, and even the most supermassive black hole couldn't spaghettify it. It was Clark-attack, pure and simple, indistinguishable from magic no matter how egg-shaped your head was. While the sphere was over 30 meters in diameter, Its walls were said to be less than a single plank length in thickness, completely two-dimensional for all intents and purposes. While it may have seemed that there would have been a better use for such a miraculous substance, allegedly the sphere needed the constant pressure of all reality trying to snuff it out to hold its shape, and it was otherwise unstable in any other conditions. Though the sphere itself interacted more or less normally with the fundamental forces of the universe, light couldn't pass through it since there was no space-time inside for it to pass through. Thus, in theory, the ontological vacuum chamber should have appeared as a total void to any observers. Eventually the day came when all the required components were assembled and ready. The precursor of transplancanian substrate had been evenly applied to the interior of the chamber, and as the space-time within became thinner and thinner, the precursor became more and more condensed. The instant the true nothing had been achieved, the precursor material around it was catalyzed to transform into the impossible substance needed to contain it. But when the researchers peered into the oblivion they had created, they were greeted by a most unexpected sight. It was a creature, a beast several times the size of a human being. Its mottled skin was a pallid and sickly grey, pockmarked here and there by molting feathers, and at the end of a long serpentine neck sat a vaguely owl-like head. It had an owl's hooked beak, at least, and its unblinking eyes were too large to move on its own. The eyes were asymmetrical in their size and alignment, however, and heavy, liver-spotted jowls sagged from its cheeks. Its body was mostly an amorphous lump of wriggling blubber, possessing only a single pair of appendages that most closely resembled naked and emaciated wings. From the moment it first appeared, the creature spent most of its time curled up against the surface of the sphere, its moist folds of fat creating enough suction to hold it in place regardless of gravity. It would occasionally use its withered appendages to drag itself along to a new spot, but otherwise, it did nothing except mutter unintelligibly to itself in an almost human voice. It should have been impossible for any sound to pass through the sphere, of course, but yet the creature's incessant muttering went on without end. It was recorded every nanosecond, subjected to analysis by the greatest human minds and the most powerful AIs, all of them unable to attribute any plausible meaning to what the entity was saying. Research was limited to passively study the light and sound that emitted from the ontological vacuum chamber, since nothing and no one could get inside, if there even was an inside to speak of. Despite the owl's vague, if deformed, resemblance to earthly life, the spectral analysis failed to confirm the presence of any known elements or molecular compounds in its body. In all the time it had been there, it had never shrunk or grown, never acquired any sustenance or produced any waste, never stopped muttering long enough to inhale even once. It had also never reacted or responded to external stimuli of any kind. If it was sentient, and it was far from clear if it was thought to be sophistically unaware of the rest of the universe. The owl was certainly an anomaly, an impossible and likely extra-dimensional being of utterly unknown origins and nature, but one that seemingly couldn't interact with the outside world at all and thus posed no threat. With its ontological prison being both inescapable from within and impenetrable from without, there was simply nothing to be done about it. And so, it was left there where it was. Everything was recorded, everything was analyzed, and sometimes new experiments were conducted, but otherwise, the owl was largely forgotten about. Okay, that time it said Crayola-colored craft dinner simmers unheated at the scullery implodes under the matron's arduous tutelage. Security Officer Joseph Grumwell claimed,
somehow managing to maintain a straight face. "Shut up, no it didn't." Researcher Luna Valdez laughed, punching him playfully in the arm. The two of them stood on a concrete walkway in front of the ontological vacuum chamber and its underground bunker, the entire setup being fairly reminiscent of a public aquarium. While the Dreadfort facility didn't exactly condone its staff treating the low-risk, non-humanoid containment level as a menagerie, on-site recreational opportunities were somewhat limited. As such, the occasional impromptu date among madness-inducing cosmic horrors was tolerated. The owl clung to its two-dimensional wall directly in front of them, folds of slimy pale flesh squished up against it, pulsating in time with some unknown internal bodily rhythms. Its large white eyes were filled with wandering white pinpricks of starlight as it idly gazed outwards, despite everyone being fairly confident it couldn't see anything. "Luna, I'm telling you, this owl's coming up with some Lewis Carroll level nonsense," Joseph insisted, before finally cracking a smile. "What do you think it is then, Smarty Pants?" "I think it's a Boltzmann brain of some kind. A being born from astronomically improbable vacuum fluctuations," she continued contemplatively. "We try to make nothing, but there can never truly be nothing, because it's too unstable. Nothing is perfect. Absolute state, and something is any deviation from that state, so nothing will always deteriorate into something eventually. Nature abhors a vacuum, after all." "Okay, but why wouldn't it just collapse into the hydrogen gas or some radiation or something? Why would nothing turn into that?" Joseph asked, gesturing towards the enormous owl-like monstrosity before them. "Well, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We tried to make an ontological vacuum which necessitated something as equally improbably and complex to balance it out, which apparently meant this thing emerging fully formed from the void like Aphrodite rising from the sea," Luna replied. "Yeah, I'm not seeing the resemblance to Aphrodite," Joseph smirked. "What really messes with my head is the thought that since light or sound can't even exist inside the bubble, what we're seeing and hearing is just a hologram on its outer surface. There's nothing actually inside the bubble at all. It could be that it's emitting its own form of radiation, and that when it crosses the threshold into our reality, it's transmuted into EM and acoustic waves," Luna speculated. "But if that's the case, we're lucky it's limiting itself to visible light and some unintelligible muttering. Otherwise, it could really do some..."
"They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand."
Luna and Joseph both went dead silent, turning their full, horrified attention to the owl who, for the first time in its recorded existence, said something they could understand. "Did you hear that?" Luna whispered softly, stepping slightly further away from the owl and slightly closer to her armed escort. The owl itself showed no change in its demeanor, and had returned to muttering nonsense, its head trembling about like a chicken in a factory farm cage. "I heard it, Luna," Joseph said, swallowing nervously. Resting one hand on his sidearm, he slowly raised the other to reach for his radio. "Site Control, this is Cromwell. Valdez and I both heard the owl speak a single comprehensible sentence. Please confirm that you heard it as well. Over."
"Cromwell, this is Site Control. Deviation from entities' established behavioral norms is confirmed,"
Site Control replied.
"The AI flagged it, and it's showing up in the recordings too. So it wasn't just our heads, thank God. Standard protocols have been automatically activated. Site's on lockdown, and no one gets in or out of the owl's house until command says so. So sit tight."
"Roger that," Joseph radioed back. "It could be nothing," Luna suggested, though she sounded far from certain. "It's constantly muttering. Eventually some of it's going to sound vaguely recognizable."
That line was from The Walrus and the Carpenter, Luna, Joseph told her. I said it was coming up with Lewis Carroll nonsense, and then it quotes The Walrus and the Carpenter. It can hear us, Luna.
It's probably always been able to hear us. Or you saying that is what it primed us to interpret it that way? It's just pareidolia, like seeing a face on Mars. Let's not assume anything until we have more data. It was then that the owl fell silent, itself an unprecedented occurrence. It raised its long neck back and coiled it slightly so that it had a better view of outside. It cocked its head towards Luna, and then Joseph, before beginning to speak again.
In ages yet to be, this Sindonian message will be carved into the face by Martian settlers, validating the delusions of their forebears.
Fucking hell, Joseph cursed under his breath. Is that enough data for you, Luna? It can hear us, and it looks like it can see us too. Don't engage it unless we have command orders. That's the protocol, Luna reminded him. Even if we can't leave the owl house, we can probably still get out of his sight.
An odd notion,
the owl muttered.
For an enlightened mind, a single glimpse of an object, from the tiniest particle to the most massive galactic supercluster, is enough to read all its intrinsic nature and infer the rest of its world line, its past, its future, and everything it will ever interact with. The world lines of these objects can also be inferred, and so on and so forth, albeit with compounding levels of inaccuracy. The further one strays from direct observation, I perpetually extrapolate word lines from everything I see and compare them with one another, allowing me to minimize the margin of error for those I cannot see directly. I see all the universe, all its space-time, and ever-growing clarity.
So, you're saying your perception of reality is like high-level psychedelic geometry? Luna asked with a raised eyebrow, her curiosity momentarily getting the better of her.
Sadly, that may be the closest your kind is capable of experiencing consciousness as I do. Yes.
Well, that's ironic, considering we thought you experienced nothing at all in there. So the light, sound, and whatever else makes contact with the ontological vacuum are transferred into something you can perceive?
They become me. And what you see is what I return to keep the balance.
Luna, I think you're right about keeping the protocol. The more we interact with this thing, the more we risk being compromised by it, Joseph whispered to her as he gently grabbed her by the arm and pulled her aside. Let's at least get to where we can't see it and wait until...
You've already been compromised, Cromwell. Valdez is to continue her dialogue with the entity and obtain as much information as possible. That's an order. Understood?
Joseph sighed before reaching for his radio to reply. Understood, sir. Over and out, he said with a shake of his head. Luna smiled at him sympathetically and gave him a consoling pat on the shoulder before turning back to face the owl. Why is it you never attempted to communicate with us until now? You've been aware of us this whole time.
That question makes no sense to me. I am speaking to you now because now is when I speak to you.
Alright, let me rephrase that question then. Up until now, you've been muttering constantly. But what you were saying was completely unintelligible to us. Why were you doing that?
I wasn't speaking to you. I spoke to others, a plethora of others, in a plethora of other tongues, all scattered across space and time and planes, holding up a lantern in daylight in hopes I might illuminate a being worthy of the title.
You're saying that you're looking for a being worthy of being? Luna asked, her voice lowering slightly at the potentially violent implications. And if you find us unworthy?
Nothing. Entropy continues, and reality marches onwards to the omega point as always. I search elsewhere for a worthy being.
Good. Luna said with a nervous swallow. In that case, I'd very much like to learn more about you. You mentioned that you speak with other worlds and times and realities. Can you see them all inside your chamber?
It's not my chamber. Now, what do you see when you look at me?
Luna froze at the question, her mind rapidly shooting off multiple responses. What did it mean by that? The fact that it had deliberately compared itself to Diogenes suggested to her that it valued virtue and detested convention. It would not have asked what she saw if it did not wish to hear itself be described as she saw it. I see a very large creature with a passing resemblance to an owl. Your size and deformed appearance are unsettling to me. Monstrous, even. But you've revealed yourself to be a highly intelligent creature, and I'm eager for the opportunity to learn more about and from you. The owl stared silently at her for a moment, and she stared back in wretched anxiety, wondering if it expected her to say more.
You do not see enough, then.
The owl muttered and then returned to muttering incoherent gibberish once again. That's it? Joseph asked irritably. Just some the meaning of life is 42 bullshit? Unbelievable. Apparently it's too much to ask timeless Lovecraftian abominations to not waste as mortals precious time. Well, we know more about it now than we did a few minutes ago, so I call that progress, Luna said through a forced smile, even though it was obvious to Joseph that she was disappointed. Let's go find some place to sit down until they let us out. Don't let it get you down, Luna. Maybe it'll— Oh shit! Joseph cursed, immediately drawing his pistol. Luna spun around and saw that the owl had shifted in position to raise its long, bony, claw-like appendage into the air, then immediately brought it down to strike the invisible wall of the ontological vacuum chamber, cascading shockwaves of light moving as slowly as molasses danced through the air, sending Luna and Joseph ducking to the floor to avoid them. The owl began to drag its wing along the wall of the chamber, creating a ghastly and ungodly screech as it went. What are you doing? Luna screamed, her hands clutched over her ears. The owl didn't respond, but its mutterings had grown louder so that they were still audible over the racket it was making. Joseph opened fire on the entity, only for his bullets to bounce harmlessly off the transplankian barrier. That's not helping! Luna shouted. Radio site control! Tell them there's a breach! The owl began to furiously peck at the interior barrier of its chamber, sending concussive waves of vibrations rattling through the concrete bunker, shaking it like an earthquake. Strange sparkling sand began falling down from the ceiling like snow, accumulating on the floor at an unnaturally quick pace. I'm pretty sure they know, Joseph shouted back. If that thing succeeds in creating even the tiniest imperfection in that sphere, she screamed with a resistant growl. Joseph reached for his radio. Site control, this is Cromwell. The owl is attempting to breach the ontological vacuum barrier. Tell me there's a contingency! The response came in the form of 7 ontological stabilization pillars spaced evenly around the perimeter of the room, whirring to life. Crackling with static and glowing with a strange indigo aura, Luna and Joseph could both feel the reinforced weight of reality as they stood in the pillars' overlapping fields. They should have, in theory, strengthened the ontological difference between the inside and outside of the chamber, toughening the transplankian substrate and making it harder for the owl to affect anything outside of it. Perhaps it did, but the owl just struck at the same chamber even harder. The force of its perturbances was still felt in full. The pillars spun even harder, bolts of ethereal lightning flickering off them and striking the chamber, all to no avail. One by one the pillars were pushed past their limits, shorting out in a small explosion that left only a smoldering metallic husk behind. As the final pillar had died, the owl unleashed an ear-splitting screech as it struck the wall of the chamber one final time before it cracked. While a basic understanding of osmosis would have led one to believe that reality would have started rushing into the chamber, instead the nothing inside began leaking out. Pure void began to seep out through that nigh infinitesimal hairline fracture, oozing out onto the ground below and pooling at its base. The walls of the chamber began to quiver and groan as its compromised structure struggled to maintain integrity, and as the void around it continued to accumulate, it slowly began to sink into it. The owl itself was placid once more, seemingly content with what it had accomplished. Luna and Joseph raced to the sealed exit, banging and pleading for it to be opened, but site control had already written them off as collateral damage. When Luna turned back to see what was happening, she was just in time to witness the last of the ontological vacuum chamber submerge into the void it had created. Once the last of it was gone, a downward implosion punched the hole deep into the earth, if not deep into space-time itself, creating a banshee-like shriek as the air rushed in to fill the hole that was left in its wake. The draft was strong enough to pull both Luna and Joseph off their feet and to the ground, but thankfully, no further than that. When the whirlwind abated, the room they found themselves in was deathly quiet, the strange coating of sand absorbing sound effectively as freshly fallen snow. Weeping and trembling, Luna slowly raised her head and saw that not even the emergency lights were working. But even in near total darkness, the void in the floor where the chamber had been was unmistakable. The sheer absence of reality before her could never be mistaken for something as mundane as darkness. She knew that she should have gotten as far away from it as possible and waited for help to arrive, but she had to know what had become of the owl. Slowly, cautiously, she crawled across the debris-strewn floor, cutting her hands and knees on shrapnel and flotsam as she inched forward, until she was at the edge of the void. Making certain that her hands were still on the solid ground, she timidly peeked her head over the edge of the void and peered down. At first she saw nothing, but then she spotted the starlight-filled orbs that were the owl's eyes staring back up at her from fathoms below. For the second time, the owl stopped muttering, and for a moment the two just stared at one another in dreadful silence.
Gaze until you can finally see, or until the world is no more. Lest I look elsewhere for a worthy being.
The Chernobyl Experiment. Warning. Classified material. Assigned to SU Branch 1-E0. SEC 0093434005-C. July 15th, 1997. The following pages have been copied from a journal that was recovered in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at Pripyat, Ukraine, by a US strike team sent in on the 3rd of August, 1997. US Log 1. Due to the amount of radiation on and in the journal, I will not have enough time to include every entry, only the main parts. 11/18/1991. Today the Soviet Union assigned my research team to Chernobyl. Ava requested that we should be airdropped in. As always, request granted. I must say, I'm kind of nervous due to the high radiation levels in that place. And the hazmat suits aren't ventilated. Oh Jesus, this is going to suck. It's 10:30, and I have to rest. I've got a big day tomorrow. 11/19/1991. We are on the helicopter right now, and the sky looks like a sheet of grey. We have been in the air for 2 hours now, and the ETA is in 10 minutes. I'm scared and regret taking this job now. 11/19/1991. Alright, we're on the ground. But we didn't land. Our helicopter's motor gave out as soon as we flew over the outskirts, almost like we were being pulled down. I swear, I saw something fly past the helicopter. The pilot's dead, and the rest of us are pretty beat up. There is no backup generator in the heli for the radio, so now we're virtually stranded. We'd head back through the woods, but the radiation level is too great, and we're about 100 miles away from any town that isn't covered in nuclear fallout. As we set up camp for the night, we saw old, dried blood on the floor and walls of the nearby hospital. Nothing unusual, I guess. I don't know what's going on, but it's scary. 11/12/1991. It's morning. Last light I kept hearing strange noises. It was almost as if something was being dragged across the rusty metal floor. Must have been an animal. Yakut is trying to contact HQ with the emergency radio, but there's no response. I'm so tired of this suit, and a crashed helicopter is not the best place to sleep. My head hurts and my legs ache from non-stop walking. 11/24/1991. 3 days have passed and no response from HQ. I wonder if our radio code is cut off or needs to be updated. Either way, we're not getting any evac. I'm starting to smell like a dead animal. I just need a shower. 11/24/1991. Our food is starting to disappear and one of our squad members is starting to go insane. He said that when he was on guard duty last night, he saw a young boy with no arms and no eyes walking in the west courtyard. Maybe our destiny is to go crazy. I sure hope not. 11/25/1991. Yakut and I woke up to gunshots this morning, and our food and most of our ammo is gone. I wonder if the Tatar took it. We're going to look for him right now and investigate. My skin is becoming itchy, and the smell is horrible. 11/25/1991. We went to the building that Yakut suggested. We made contact with that thing Tatar saw. There's more than one of them, and they're all hostile. None of them looked the same. We managed to kill one of them. It almost looked like a spider with an infant's body in the face. The eyes were split in half and the legs were extremely elongated, almost around 4 feet each. No matter how much we shot it, it wouldn't go down. Take off the limbs. It won't kill them right away, but it leaves them immobile. Soon they will bleed out. As the one we injured bled out, it let out a blood-churning scream. It sounded like 6 voices at once, almost impossible to describe. We also found Tatar's body. His face was all mangled and his gun. It was in pieces, scattered across the floor. 11/25/1991. As I was writing my last entry, Yakut and I were ambushed. I ran to the nearest room. I guess that scream attracted more. It proves that whatever those are, they have the ability to communicate. Yakut, I locked the door too soon. I had to. I heard his AK go off and I heard him run. Shit, they're trying to get in. 11/25/1991. I'm almost sure that I'm going to die here. There's no food and a bunch of things out there. I managed to see more of them. Tons of them. Most of them seem to be women and children with horrible deformations. I think they are victims of the accident. How can they stay alive? Some of them don't even have eyes, and others have such a thin skin you can see their organs. Some are like spiders,
Others are radiated to the point you can't even tell they're human. I saw two that had wings. I'm estimating around 10 or 11 meter wingspan. And believe me, they can sure as hell fly. They have claws that are very thick and around a meter long, and their entire ribcage is missing, replaced by thousands of fungus-like strings that just dangle. It's not hair or fur. Jesus, this is like a never-ending nightmare. 11/25/1991. I have seen the devil. That thing that took Yakut. That was no animal. As far as I can tell, there's only one of this kind. Just pale white, webbed fingers and feet. No reproductive organs. No arms, just the hands coming out of the shoulders. No eyes, and the legs are reverse jointed. That is what fear looks like. 11/26/1991. I can't sleep. I'm so afraid of them. Even though I can't see them at night, I'm still scared. The fear of death keeps me awake. I am so hungry. Not as much thirsty. I've been drinking water from a broken pipe in here. Every time I take off my gas mask to drink, I get a headache. The radioactivity is killing me. I can hear babies crying. Are there survivors? No, not here. I think I'm going to sneak out tonight. If I can't see them, they can't see me. But what if they can smell me? I'll bring my AK-47 along, just in case. I ventured down the hallway to the door at the end. It was locked, so I just turned left. In the first room to my right, I saw blood, organs and cracked bones strewn all over. They weren't adult bones. They were infants. What kind of fucking sick creatures are these? This means only the most basic primal instincts are left in them. I want to die. This place is hell. Literally. My stomach burns. I must be sick. I can hear some of them sniffing the room's door. They know I am here. My skin is starting to become weak. The lightest touch bruises it. I'm scared. They were looking into the helicopter's wreckage. They took the pilot's body. Now it's 1:30 a.m. At least, that's what my watch says. I'm going to try to get some sleep. 11/26/1991. I just woke up. I can hear gunshots. It's not AK shots. There's bolt action and semi-automatic. It's not Yakut. I can see shadowy figures outside with guns. Then they vanished. I'm tired. I must be hallucinating. I think I'm insane. I'm going to help myself. I'm going to help myself end this nightmare. I'm going to end it. Help myself by ending it. There's a window in this room. And the balcony. A beautiful balcony. Oh, such a beautiful balcony. almost perfect for jumping.
I'm a sociologist who participated in the God experiment. My first breath 1. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to play God? Some questions should stay unanswered. We selected 7 individuals for the study. My colleague found it important to have a radical mixture of gender and sexual orientation. Discrete cameras were set up throughout the participants' home and places of business. We instructed the subjects to proceed with their daily activities, normally, as if nothing had changed. We then told our people a white lie. We told them a team of scientists would be working to alter their lives. Allegedly, the group analyzed the recordings and applied subtle changes to the subjects' real-time routines. Each modification would be designed to improve personal productivity and overall contentment. We told subjects that they would not notice any differences whatsoever. It could be as simple as a passerby saying hi. We also forbid all contact with us during this time. The reality was that we did nothing. We just watched. In the interest of avoiding the ire of recent legal proceedings, I will avoid using last names. I worked with a respected sociologist named Thomas, or Tommy for short. Tom's prestige in the industry secured our funding in the first place. I considered myself an intern. My job entailed ordering pizza, bringing coffee, and answering phones. Sometimes Thomas allowed me to watch the cameras whilst he slept or left the building. Not a bad gig for a 23-year-old kid with a sociology degree. That changed soon after it started. My hatred for my job started when our first subject, Michael, began to behave erratically. The biography listed him as Subject 001, a straight white male, age 28. He stood at 6 feet 3 inches. He weighed 190 pounds. He had dark brown hair with a blemish on the upper right corner of his eyebrow. Mike did not have a girlfriend at the time. Thankfully, Tom considered that factor. It did not take long for things to go haywire. On the second day of record keeping, I caught Mike talking to himself in the middle of the night.
I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. Are you sure? I don't want to do it.
The noise nearly caused me to fall out of my chair. The rest of the day had been silent. I checked the cameras twice, but found no one else there. Thomas had left the building on another one of his errands. I texted him an alert just as Michael jumped out of bed on the infrared and walked to his door. Camera 3. One is losing his marbles. Tommy walked into our makeshift laboratory a couple of minutes later. He wore a look of guaranteed excitement and an undersized white coat that barely covered his overstuffed belly. Crumbs on his jacket suggested that snacking had caused him to slack off next door. Yet again. Tom looked fascinated when he saw the screen. He watched the monitor over my shoulder like a parrot. Michael banged his head against the wall. My colleague sounded downright giddy when he exclaimed, "It's happening. Record this, kid." Did not know what it meant, but I followed orders. After about 20 headbangs, Michael stopped moving. We waited and watched for 10 minutes. We checked his vitals. Somehow Michael was not injured. He only fell asleep. Standing up. It is an eerie feeling to watch a man on the verge of losing his mind. The curtains in his apartment fluttered nervously in the wind. Every few hours, Michael roused himself from sleep and checked the window nervously, then returned to his perch by the bedroom door. He repeated this trend a few times throughout the night. He didn't get back in bed at all that evening. The next day, Michael got a promotion. We had nothing to do with it. We watched the whole thing from a hidden cubicle camera. Michael's boss sounded truly grateful. She considered Michael's job performance to be worthy of recognition. To boot, the firm had been particularly successful that quarter. That meant a big bonus. The shit-eating grin on Michael's face told us that he considered the experiment to be responsible. Our subject got very drunk that night. We did not capture the bar in our video feed. I did, however, catch his walk of shame sometime around 2 in the morning. I adjusted the audio and found the guy talking to himself once again.
I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. Are you sure? I don't want to do it.
Michael walked into the apartment and flicked the light switch. The room remained quiet and empty. He repeated his favorite little phrase over and over again. He futzed around the living room in an apparent panic.
I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. Are you sure? I don't want to do it.
It annoyed me. To be honest, I started to doubt my colleague. Unstable subjects tend to skew results. I had not considered the more dire consequences at this time. "Who's he talking to?" I asked. Tom didn't answer. Michael walked towards the kitchen and grabbed the glass of water from the fridge. His movement seemed extremely erratic. The overall behavior reminded me of an animal with rabies, especially the way one leg dragged behind the other. Suddenly, as if hearing something, Michael stopped and stared out the kitchen window. Water spilled all over the floor. Michael stayed in that position for 5 minutes. Then, he offered one last line in the direction of the kitchen door.
Are you sure?
He then sprinted outside without another word. "Switch to camera 4, Tommy barked over my shoulder. I did as I was told. I swear, that's it. The memory of this still keeps me up at night. Michael's drunken shape came back into focus on the green grass of the apartment complex. The receiver taped to his chest captured the rapid breathing as his haphazard footsteps traced a path that led in only one direction. Headlights and horns blasted only 50 feet away. The freeway. "Tom, this is a problem. This is a big fucking problem." I must have repeated that phrase over 1,000 times, but my pleas were ignored by my wide-eyed companion. I grabbed the office phone and quickly tried to find an emergency contact. All the while, Michael teetered in between traffic carelessly like a missing toddler. "There's nothing we can do," Tom muttered. "What do you want me to say?" Michael's body exploded the moment it met the tractor trailer. He died that day. Our benefactor compensated the family handsomely. Litigation was temporarily avoided. The God experiment continued with the remaining subjects. Uninterrupted, for 5 weeks. The God experiment's second trial claimed a 29-year-old woman. Her name was Carolyn. According to the bio, the subject stood at 5 feet 3 inches. She weighed 135 pounds. Carolyn had dirty blonde hair that met mildly hazy eyes, with astigmatism affecting both lenders. Survey results indicated a surprising lack of romantic partners in the picture. Regardless, she was a female who pursued men exclusively. That fact checked Tommy's second box. So entered subject 002. Carolyn lived alone in a small apartment close to home. She preferred it that way. The short distance made it easy to check on her mother, Jacqueline, twice a day. Jacqueline suffered from stage 2 breast cancer, and the debilitating result of the chemotherapy just started to take effect around the time of our study. But she never complained. Some had it worse. Her dad died from the same disease years back, and nobody wanted that. Her brother was working now, and Carolyn considered that a good thing. But no one knew how long Sean could stay employed. Minimum wage positions tended to be seasonal. She told friends on the phone that the new job seemed lucrative, but scary. What if something happened to him? What if he died? If she lost either one, she might just lose her mind. And so, late at night, Carolyn prayed. I liked to listen on the audio whilst Tommy snored in the hallway. She asked God for the same things we all do. A game-changing cure for her mum, maybe, who started to look thinner every day. Perhaps her brother could land a manager position at a new store in town.
He has so much potential,
she would say. Her voice rose slightly past a whisper every time she repeated that line.
Give him strength to apply himself this time.
Carolyn also asked God when it would be time to meet a man worth the wait. That last one seemed a lot less important than the rest, though, and stayed noted as such in all prayers. She repeated the routine every single night. Nobody ever answered. That changed on the second week of our study. Jacqueline had an important doctor's appointment in the morning. Her daughter stayed up late into the night with worry. She said 17 prayers, 6 Hail Marys, 6 Our Fathers, and 5 personalized messages to the big man himself. Somehow, the kid got something right. Excitement overwhelmed the car's audio the moment the two of them got back inside. Jacqueline spoke with an apprehensive tone at first.
Wait, I can't hear the doctor. He mumbles when he talks. The chemo actually worked?
The backdrop of the corporate parking lot suddenly painted a beautiful scene. Mother and daughter embraced for several long moments. Static from their windbreakers corrupted the microphone for a moment. They both wiped tears from their eyes and they sat back in their seats.
Chemo actually worked.
Carolyn coughed a couple times to clear her voice.
Doctor said you needed a follow-up scan, some new medicine, but no more treatment.
She paused and looked at her mother with admiration.
You are in remission, young lady.
I paused the video. That moment caused me to tear up as well. The poor battle-worn woman smiled brightly underneath her wig. She looked young again. I guess the recognition of salvation took off 10 years. It was beautiful to see something good happen. Finally, in a string of so much bad. Tom appeared over my shoulder. Screenshot that. I did as I was told. We resumed the video a second later.
Call your brother, he worries.
Carolyn's mother usually wore a gruff and unfriendly expression, but today, nothing could contain the excited sparkle in those weary eyes.
Let's all get a drink. Oh, he's on speakerphone. He called us.
Carolyn giggled.
Sean, can you hear us? Guess who just became a full-timer?
A confident young male voice crackled through the secondary audio. Both of Carolyn's wishes came true that same day. And so, the family celebrated well into the night. They chose a restaurant on the outskirts of town. We did not have this location on our camera feed. I hope they had a good time. Once again, our cameras caught a drunk subject stumbling home after hours. I was alone at the time when I enhanced the audio. Her nervous voice caused my blood to run cold.
Are you okay? Okay, are you okay? Okay, are you okay? Okay.
Carolyn mumbled the words on loop like a depressing song. Are you okay?
Okay, are you okay? Okay, are you okay? Okay.
Tommy promised his wife a real dinner for the first night in who knows how long. I promised to cover. I called and texted him about 1,000 times. Subject 2. Same symptoms. We cannot let this fucking happen again. Answer the fucking phone, Tommy. I did not receive a response. Carolyn teetered around, her family running confused stutter step. She repeated her new phrase to the empty room a few more times. The whole thing seemed bizarre. Too bizarre for just a crazy night of drinking. Did not think drugs could have been involved, at least not voluntarily. The girl didn't even keep alcohol in the house. After 5 minutes, Carolyn walked to the door and stepped into the rain. The temperature read 43 degrees Fahrenheit. She did not have shoes, a sweater, or a hat. I swapped through views as quickly as possible in order to catch up. After a few moments, camera 2 found our subject in her backyard. A dusty cornfield sat on the corner of the rural property, and Carolyn walked towards it slowly. She did not look worried or in a rush. The mic caught cool, calm, and collected breaths through the rain. In fact, for the first time in the entire experiment, she seemed at peace. Blood pressure and vitals lowered to healthier levels. Her pulse did not indicate any issues. Carolyn reached the edge of the cornfield before long. She turned to look one last time towards the house and smiled. Part of me still feels she smiled at the camera. Without warning, a blunt object struck her head from behind. I sat dumbfounded and helpless as a blurry shape dragged our subject away. The audio caught one last line before the mic fell into the maze.
Are you okay? Okay.
Subject 2 is still missing to this day. Have you ever wondered what it's like to watch 7 lives fall apart on camera? Picture yourself on a train ride over a mountain covered in ice. You hear the avalanche, a monotonous rumble of shifting rocks and billowing snow over the cold air. That noise can only mean one thing, right? You're sure death is coming, but no one in the carriage screams. No one is crying. Instead, it's calm and quiet, right up until the end. Subject 3 was a transgender male named Courtney. According to our biography, the participant stood 5 feet 6 inches. He weighed 150 pounds. In the photograph, dark, unblemished skin met stylish black hair shaved short on one side. Courtney was in a relationship with a female, but the happy couple had not moved in together. I considered camera placement to be ideal inside the cramped studio apartment. From an early age, Courtney exhibited clear signs that birth did not match the right body. Early onset identity crisis led to complexities including depression and anxiety that went untreated throughout the teenage years. The madness ended when medical professionals took corrective measures to implement a lifelong dream. He worked a high-paying job in the healthcare industry and held a padded HSA to boot. He paid for the whole procedure himself. Even still, Courtney's parents ceased all communication. The fact haunted him. Courtney never considered himself religious. Survey results indicated that identification with a few major concepts. He believed in a God. He believed in judgment and punishment and some sort of peace in the end for all of us. Like everybody, Courtney had his own issues with the big man or big lady. On the topic of omnipotence, he wrote, "If there is a puppet master, I am his missing string." I found that sort of dark, but he still prayed for some things. The messages delivered by his bedside in the dark of the night were to no one in particular. Each offering began with something like,
I don't know if anyone's listening, but...
because it felt safer that way. Easier not to damn yourself with one if you have a chance with another. He prayed for his family to talk to him again. He prayed for acceptance. He prayed for his little sister's health and another promotion and better medicine and less makeup. But most of all, he asked for something most may be able to understand. He prayed for enough money to make his girlfriend a wife and start a life. In the second week of our study, things seemed to be heading in the right direction. A late-night conversation in the bedroom with Samantha broached the topic of marriage. His little sister, Sarah, texted often and claimed she felt fine. The course of his career continued to trend upwards, and bonus season claimed another happy participant. However, we began to notice similar symptoms the Tuesday after Subject 2 went missing. Courtney's mother called that morning. The conversation started pleasant enough. She talked about herself mostly. The gossip at the library, favorite television shows, the usual. However, the topic eventually led to where it always did. Her father's drinking problem. Dad must have heard the last part when he walked by. He offered one soul-crushing bit of advice into the receiver, whilst Mum tried to escape the room.
Tell my little girl I say hello.
Tom and I were both in the office at the time. The results of that single sentence were almost too horrible to bear. Courtney was in his car and approaching a bridge. The phone line disconnected, but he screamed into it anyway.
Mom? Dad? That's it? You have nothing else to say to me? Why did you even fucking call me? Why do this to me?
The line beeped without sympathy. Something inside the poor man's eyes looked dead inside. I did not require 720p video inside the dashcam to properly categorize the look of defeat and utter anguish. I wanted to help him, as always. There was no time. Plus, the rules of the God experiment forbade interaction. Tommy looked ready to make an exception when Courtney pulled over and got out the car. We switched cameras. Our participants stood on a narrow sidewalk and stared into the distance for a couple of minutes. When he walked forward, fog had started to pour in at an altitude. Rain had floated in and out of the area all evening. Quietly, Courtney began to whisper one line on loop, just like all the others.
I am your missing string. I am your missing string. I'm your missing string. I'm your missing string.
Tommy appeared really worried at that moment. He grabbed his cell phone and furiously texted a number that I did not recognize. Then he reached over and paused the video, and instead pointed to an opposite monitor. Camera 4 showed the inside of the car.
What the fuck is that?
It was impossible to see any features, but one fact seemed clear. A black shape sat very still in the back seat, at about medium height. After a few moments, the door opened beside it, and something exited in the opposite direction. We frantically adjusted the cameras to get a view, but there was no one else in sight. I resumed the video and checked on Courtney. He dangled carelessly off a steel support beam as I repeated my favorite slew of curses. The cold, hard ground several hundred feet below did not seem to be worrying to anyone but Tom and me.
Where do all the missing strings go?
Courtney asked our audio feed. Then, he slipped his shirt off. He unattached the microphone. He finished one final sachet around the pole. Then, Subject 3 took a dramatic swan dive into the below. I still wonder about his question. I don't think anybody really knows. Michelle was a transgender female who never quite adjusted to the cameras in her home. That fact alone made her much smarter than the rest. It is an unmistakable and itching feeling to be watched. Some people recognize it better than others. The sensation can creep through to your guts like a virus. It makes all those little hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Survival instincts implore human beings to seek shelter in these situations. It is always best to avoid the eyes of the hunter. But what if there is no way to be sure of safety? What if the lion has eyes in every corner of the jungle? Subject 4's survey indicated a hermit-like behavior. She did not have many family or friends. Her employer was an online blog that allowed employees to work from home. The topics of conversation for this site were nothing short of the usual dog shit you see in the National Enquirer and similar publications. Popular headlines included, "Woman marries alien," "Bigfoot kept lumberjack as love slave," and more of the usual attention-seeking crap. The more absurd, the better. Michelle had been with the company nearly 10 years. Her articles and conspiracy theories built a reputation that stretched across the country. Nevertheless, a layoff at corporate headquarters claimed her job in the second week of our study. As with the past participants, our video caught all the gory details. Our subject cried in bed for days. She did not leave her apartment for a week. Doctor appointments stayed cancelled. Groceries were delivered to the house, and the few friends remaining offered nothing outside of a few half-hearted text messages. So it goes. Michelle pursued the employment market relentlessly. Personally, I thought this indicated a willingness to take life more seriously, The resume compiled online looked impressive to my untrained eyes. She called and begged several other companies that claimed to be hiring. She filled out 1 million applications online. But I suppose the job market is tough for the type of person who once wrote that her landlord is a lizard. Most newspapers insisted on more serious experience. A few fellow blog sites openly laughed during the interviews on the phone. The windfalls of hope and repeated disappointment became tough to watch. All of these factors added up and left Michelle at home all day, alone. She turned to alcohol somewhere in the 3rd week. Tommy blamed the strange behavior that followed on her excessive drinking. I remained unconvinced. The warning signs that I had come to identify seemed to be repeating themselves in Subject 4. One hungover morning, Michelle moved a chair into a blind spot in the kitchen. She sat there for 4 hours. The entire apartment stayed quiet during this time. When Michelle emerged, she seemed suspicious of everything from the cat to her own shadow. She searched the apartment endlessly for something, and that made us worry. During setup, Tom etched one of 4 cameras into the wood of her nightstand. Sure enough, she found it. After tearing up the entire room, she talked to us openly from that point on. That revelation certainly affected our test results, but, as always, our responsibility stayed the same. Interference and correction did not present itself as an option. We were only observers. The camera became a prop in Michelle's bout of self-destruction. She carried that and a bottle of Jack Daniels everywhere. She talked to both as if live-streaming. Most of the messages were incoherent and similar to the nonsense she used to peddle for a living.
Reporting live from the kitchen, water has turned to a mysterious brown color. Back to you, Doc. Reporting from the bedroom, something is scratching underneath my floor. Can you guys hear that? Reporting from the den, someone is outside my door. Is that one of you?
Nothing I saw or heard on screen confirmed her theories. However, my concerns started to get more serious when Michelle refused to sleep. 2 days without rest turned to 3, and 4, and 5. Her behavior became manic. On several occasions, I caught her staring at the walls for hours at a time. Soon enough, Michelle found the remaining cameras. She took to hiding the blind spots that made it impossible for me to see her after that. The frequency and length of live streams radically decreased. I hope that wherever she went, Michelle finally found some sleep. The apartment was very quiet during that time. There were no other voices inside. One morning, many days later, someone knocked on the apartment door. Michelle had not been outside in 2 weeks. Tom snored so loud in the lab that I almost missed it. The knock started out quiet and unassuming. After a few unanswered raps, it grew more aggressive, until it soon became an absolute pounding that stirred my colleague from his sleep and caused Michelle to sprint into the line of sight in panic.
Do you guys hear it now?
We did.
What do I do?
I had no idea. Tom pulled out his phone again. He had a block on the device that obscured my vision from the side. I asked him angrily about the text messages. He started to answer me as Subject 4 walked over to the door.
Shit, she cannot answer that door,
he muttered instead. Michelle could not hear us. She'd looked through the peephole neurotically. Then she shrugged her shoulders, caught a quick nervous breath, and unlocked the chain.
Why don't we have vision in the hallway?
I asked, fearing the answer. It came seconds later. Gunfire erupted into our headphones. A bullet caught Subject 4 in the head. I knew immediately that our Michelle was dead. She didn't even have time to scream. Tom pulled the plug from every computer, monitor, and power grid in the lab. Video and audio disappeared in kind. He fired off a few more rapid-fire messages. In a few short moments, the God experiment fell completely offline. His next words removed any doubt in my mind.
We have to help the remaining subjects. We're running out of time.
God found me in the middle of a hurricane. We were absolutely flying down an ill-advised stretch of I-95. Storm warnings buzzed our phones in our pockets like a pair of vibrators. That evening, the road stayed slick with white waves of spitting rain and bits of black ice that stuck to the asphalt like butter. I clung to the steering wheel and kept my eyes on the road, but still begged my friend to fill me the fuck in. "Who are you texting? What's going on? Where are we going? Say something!" Tom tore his eyes from the phone and finally turned to face me. "How do you think we have any money?" I stared blankly. I'd never really considered that fact. Studies always had donors. Could be anyone, individuals, institutions, companies, or organizations, as long as they all followed the letter of the law, which we did not. My colleague flicked my forehead like an arsehole. I swatted his hand away and tried to focus on the road. "How do you think paid for all the computers in the back seat? Or the lab we sit in every day? How about the extremely expensive video equipment we used to monitor 5 individuals the weeks they were murdered?" 5? Priyanka? "Take the next exit." I did as told. The dripping water through the window made me shiver involuntarily. I did it myself this time, he mumbled. "Better that way, for a dissident. Not to put a little arsenic in her girlfriend's pepper chicken." "What the fuck are you talking about?" "You have to talk to me, man. I'm the one driving." Tom took one long look at me before he finally sighed and replied. "There is a man behind the curtain, Justin. There always is. We need to get away from him." A massive oak tree fell from the side of the road. It landed about 20 feet ahead, and that should have given me enough time to stop, but the brakes in my car screeched unevenly. I did my best to swerve, and so, we did not crash immediately. Tom had the time to offer one final line in the chaos before wooden splinters ripped apart the paneling of my mid-sized SUV. "There's always a man behind the curtain." The next few moments in my memory is a mixture of broken glass and hurling objects. I can remember the tumbles pretty clearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 suspensions of gravity in total. Seatbelts kept us both stationed securely to the vehicle, but the same could not be said for the piles of electrical equipment. The good news was that the last turnover put the car right side up, but the bad news was that we were in the middle of a New Jersey swamp, and Tom was losing a lot of blood. He faded in and out of consciousness. My arm felt broken. Nonetheless, adrenaline allowed me to pull my colleague from the car and lay him down on the hill. My middle-class pipe dream sunk into 2 feet of mud with all of our equipment. We were stuck. The gaining rain made it impossible to drag ourselves up. I tried to stop Tom's bleeding with my shirt. That was about as successful as trying to stop a spout with a pin. The worst wound the old man sustained was his wrinkled old head. Red bits of skin and flesh poked through my white shirt. The pulsing scrape seemed to rain up all the same. I don't think he had much time left. I do think the integrity of that moment made him reconsider a few things in life. "He would have tortured her." The words made me feel cold inside. Why? Who is he? Why does he care? I don't understand, Tom. Why would you kill one of our subjects?
It was just like going to sleep.
A pair of headlights arrived by the side of the road soon after. I could barely see the figure that gracefully slid down the embankment. He wore an impeccable black suit that fit his thin and agile form flawlessly. I waved and called out, "There's a man dying here!" But he did not reply. The rain started to erode the embankment we were lying upon. The shadow in the suit watched me struggle to hold up Tom's body with a broken arm and a couple of cracked ribs. He snorted audibly and said, "Good evening to you both," in an awkwardly confident tone. I tried to reply back. Help had arrived. I thought we were saved. But before I could, The man Tommy once called God shot him 2 times in the stomach. There was only one subject remaining in the study. Me. I wished I wasn't alive. That's such a bullshit statement these days. What do the kids call it? Basic? The same line could be applied to waiting in the doctor's office with a common cold, or sneezing in someone's face, or using the restroom in a public place. It just doesn't mean anything anymore, you know? Exaggeration and veneer have taken the guts out of the very words that meant to imply the severity of my situation. Truthfully now, let's try that again. I wished I was not alive. If you thought the devil capable of immense torture, then God will almost certainly offer you a pleasant surprise. He brought me somewhere inside. The drugs that coursed through my veins in an IV were unlike anything I'd ever experienced within college. Pain became something to rest my hat on when breathing was no longer a required chore. The shapes inside my teeming space blended together like 3 white rabbits shoveling through a surgery room. I felt insanity grip the corners of my brain and hold it tight like a vice. I prayed to death through gritted teeth and begged him to visit me that night. But he didn't. Tommy knew about this fate. His last words told me everything I needed to know. There was a man behind every curtain. I would like to talk about the God experiment. Through all the chaos of pain and pounding vibrations in my body, I could hear the voice as clear as it could be. It boomed and resonated throughout the hollow room as if on echo. I spoke back as a humble servant prepared to meet my maker. Subject 5 is a little lady named Priyanka. She is a 25-year-old bisexual female. A white rod of lightning intercepted my mind. Again. Subject 5 was killed by Subject 6. Tommy. The pain grew worse. God did not like my answer. I asked him why. His response was to draw a deep breath and overwhelming sigh. Kid's too loopy. This ain't gonna work. We'll have to try something again later. I looked around the room and tried to make out my surroundings. The walls were stained with waves of brown water damage and growing mold. The floor felt concrete. My bare feet were tied up to the legs of a rickety wooden chair. I shook it nervously. Fuck! God screamed in annoyance. This is not the plan. This is not the fucking plan. A female voice called out from somewhere in the background. Life never fits a plan, Diego. But you were the handler on this one. Your fuck up. A third deep tone murmured its support. Diego's reply seemed angry. I did not know why. His memory was supposed to wipe. The feds tested it years ago. Hell, we used the same drugs in Subject 6 for 6 years. Is it too soon? The female voice sounded downright cocky when she replied. Not too soon. Just doesn't always work the way you want. The voices converged in a cacophony of whispers too difficult to understand. Somewhere underneath all the horrible things churning inside of me, clarity approached. You're not God. I offered the words to the room in a daze. Oh, now he gets it. The male voice laughed again. Then he punched me in the mouth. Haven't you heard? The state is God. The G-man looked at the bruise on his fist while I spit blood in his direction. It all added up in that moment. The subjects were dissonant. They were destined to die because the government wanted them dead. Our purpose in the God experiment was only to ensure death came at the right time. We have to kill him. The Attorney General... The AG doesn't have to know anything. The lady cut off her partner. They both paused. Do you hear that? I took the momentum of the moment to throw my chair on the floor. The struggle that ensued did not favor my side. I broke my legs and managed to scurry free. But soon enough, the third giant crow wrapped his arms around mine, while the other two punched me. When Tom burst through the unlocked door to our room, I outright laughed at the sheer stupidity. The fat man was covered in blood. It dripped from his head and lab coat like an absurd C-rated horror movie. However, his next few actions were nothing short of heroic. Without them, I would not be alive to tell this story. Thank the Lord, Tom brought his big old gun with him. 2 big bullets caught my attackers immediately. The third let go of me just before Tom shot him in the knee. I stumbled out of the room and escaped the scene of crime just in time. Tom caught one more bullet himself that night. He died along the same men that ruined his life. The government selected 7 subjects from radically different backgrounds. The names were Mike, Carolyn, Courtney, Michelle, Priyanka, Tommy, and me. The reason behind multiple genders and orientations seemed pretty simple. Our handlers wanted to prove a point during this run of the God experiment. Everyone is vulnerable at any time. Anyone can be taken care of outside of the public eye. The subjects we wanted were targeted for execution by the same government that collected their taxes. And so, there is no more apt description of our commanders-in-chief. The state is God. If you ask more answers, I'm afraid they're short in supply. For the past 6 months, I have been forced to hide, and I don't know why the feds allow me to be alive. I can feel their eyes on me every time I go to bed. Just before I submitted this final update, the camera on my laptop flickered to red. The state is watching me. They're watching you, too. I only wanted someone else to see. The Romanian Knowledge Experiment by JPVL1. In 1960, Alexandru Sift, a well-known scientist, traveled to the forest of Hoia Basiu, located in East Romania. The Hoia forest had the reputation of being a hotspot for paranormal activities, the main reason for Sift's motivation. He wrote many notes about his experiences there, but many were burnt upon his death in 1993. The notes that survived detailed his experiments on the forest with test subjects. In every one of his notes, he ended by saying, "Knowledge is harmful. Ignorance is bliss." 10 years later, the Romanian government developed interest in a few notes that survived, so they sought to recreate his experiments. 3 men volunteered for it. They were told this was simply to see how an average person would manage to travel in a foreign territory only using a compass and a light source. Of course, they were lies, as no sane man would volunteer if they knew what awaited them. They were also told there would be a substantial reward should they succeed. The first test subject was brought by helicopter to the zone west of the forest at midnight. He carried with him a backpack, food, water, a compass, and an oil lantern with enough oil to last until morning. He was instructed to keep moving east until he hit a road, which would lead him into a cabin where a few government agents awaited him. He was also told to stop every 30 minutes to record any and all events on a sheet of paper. He arrived at the cabin at 2 a.m. He handed the sheet to the agents and was driven to the nearby city, where he was handed his reward. His sheet read the following. 0:30 a.m.
I stopped at a nearby creek to rest and eat. Being in a forest at night with only an oil lantern for a source of light really managed to scare the hell out of me. I thought I kept seeing more shadows than there really were.
1 a.m.
I stopped at a little clearing to change the oil. I swear, there must be something out there following me. I can almost be sure there was a shadow that wasn't from a tree. Maybe an animal?
1:30 a.m.
Now, I'm definitely freaked out. I saw something staring at me in the distance. I only managed to see its silhouette, but as soon as I looked at it, it vanished. I'm starting to second doubt this experiment.
1:55 a.m.
I'm on the road. I can see the cabin from here. That thing from before kept following me. The more I walked, the more it got closer. Thankfully, I haven't seen it for a while. So I figure I'll just get to the cabin without any more delays.
The first subject remained in alarm for a few days afterward, but soon returned to a calm state. The second test subject was deployed in the same spot as the previous one on the following night. He had the same exact gear, except instead of an oil lantern, he had an infrared camera. He arrived at the cabin at 5 a.m. The agents noticed he was physically and psychologically shaken. He was panting and crying in fear. His sheet read the following. 0:30 a.m.
This camera really doesn't help me navigate. I even fell a few times because of it. Almost everything I see is blue and black, except for the occasional red spot of an animal or bird.
1 a.m.
I don't know what the fuck you guys put out here with me, but it's not funny. I took a break to drink some water, and when I heard a rattle coming from deep within the forest, I took my camera to see what it was, but I can be sure that was no normal animal. It was big, but hunched over. I couldn't make out the details since it was glowing bright red. I slowly walked away from it, never losing it out of my sight, even though it stayed completely immobile. I found a small ditch to hide. I guess it's better to write in here than out in the open. I'll quicken up my pace. The faster I get out of here, the better.
4:30 a.m.
I'm sorry for not writing more frequently. I just never had the chance. Shortly after the last entry, I heard it walking towards me. I hid in a small cave and waited for it to pass. I took so long because of that. It didn't leave me alone. I'll probably not write anything else until I get to safety. The last thing I want is to be surprised by that thing while my guard is down.
The second test subject was visibly stressed and taken to a psychologist for 3 months. The third subject never came back. He was deployed in the same spot on the next night. He had the same gear, except he had a night vision camera. When the agents were leaving the shack, they noticed a worn and ragged piece of paper on their doorstep. It had only one entry. It read the following. 0:05 a.m.
If you find this, please tell my family I love them. These may be my last words. After I couldn't see the helicopter anymore, I turned on the camera to check my surroundings. I can see it 20 meters in front of me. It doesn't move as I write this. It doesn't even blink. It has no eyebrows. It's higher than any human or bear I have ever encountered. It's hunched like a gorilla, supporting its weight on the extremities of its limbs. I can't even call those things hands. It has fish-like eyes, no pupils. Pure, engulfing darkness. Oh God, it's tearing down the trees as it moves.
After the conclusion of the experiment, the Romanian government placed an electrified fence and guard towers surrounding the entire Hoia Bashu forest. They made sure not to let anyone in or out.
The Hotel Raconteurs by Two-Away. There is a place, an intangible space, that's believed to be within the collective consciousness of humankind. This transitory mindscape has been dubbed l'Hôtel
raconteurs, by those who have discovered it. In this case study, we will examine the history of l'hôtel raconteurs, the alleged procedure used to reach it, its purpose, outcomes, reagents, and steps, and its place in the modern world. History. In the early 1950s, a Quebecois think tank happened to stumble across a perfect storm of psychological experiments that resulted in the discovery of this phenomena. In an effort to treat excessive trauma to those who had witnessed and or suffered the horrific events of World War II, specifically the Normandy massacres, a strange sort of ritual was born. Upon its first successful implementation, it was believed that a key part of the psyche had been reached in one Jacques Tremblay. While being subjected to what are now considered unethical mental health experiments, Jacques retreated to a place deep in his mind and appeared to be in a catatonic state. Upon returning to consciousness, Jacques reported being transported to a grand hotel. The lobby was intricate, with paintings and futuristic light fixtures. The alabaster furnishings were described poignantly as simplistic, yet unnerving. It was also mentioned that the lighting was improper, as though it glared at the observer from the finely polished pillars regardless of the angle they were approached from. According to Jacques' account, there was a grand divided staircase and several doors, accompanied by some meagre furnishings, carpeting, chairs, tables, the most peculiar of which being paintings on the walls that were familiar yet unrecognizable. The more time he spent in this lobby, the more a feeling of terror grew, as if he wasn't wanted there. Jacques proceeded through one of the doorways, in which he was met by a seemingly endless hallway of doors. They all appeared to contain memories, or moments of his life which he felt anxiety, fear, or anger. Upon choosing a door, Jacques claimed to have relived the moment that, while in captivity, the 12th SS Panzer Division began to murder Canadian prisoners of war. According to his account, he changed the moment by not speaking and keeping his head down, a distinct contrast to the behavior he claimed to have previously exhibited during the event, in which he swore and screamed at the young German soldier who gouged out his left eye. Due to this alleged change to the memory, Jacques claimed that his left eyeball was saved and remained intact. Following this experiment, Jacques' behavior and outlook on life appeared to be significantly improved. Shortly before the end of his life, in the year of 1988, a drawing of Jacques was found that resembled the description of l'hôtel raconteurs, given by all those who have witnessed it. The researchers tirelessly attempted to mimic the conditions that led to this alleged mindscape, ultimately resulting in the death of at least one veteran. Eventually, the researchers found the methods unnecessary to recreate the circumstances that led to the Hotel of Memories that Jacques reached. The space itself was dubbed l'Hôtel Raconteurs, or the Storyteller's Hotel, by the researchers. The procedure. The necessary reagents for a participant to reach l'Hôtel Raconteurs are as follows. At least one additional person, dubbed the facilitator, who is to subject the participant to the procedure's more difficult aspects and encourage the proper facilitation of the procedure's objectives. A comfortable, isolated environment to prevent foreign involvement or external stimuli. Relevant to the participant, emotion-evoking and trauma-inducing forms of stimulation. Powerful sedatives. Propofol appears to work effectively, but opium and laudanum have been used with varied results. An analog form of time management, wristwatch, pocket watch, etc. Items that run on batteries may work but are discouraged. Winding mechanisms are strongly advised. Any kind of strong adhesive tape, rope, heavy fabric, or binding that may be used to restrain an individual. Primarily, the ritual requires that the participant, henceforth referred to as observer, be the victim of some kind of traumatic experience. The significance and impact of the trauma appears to differ, but must be considered a burden of substantial weight to the observer. The steps. Number 1. The observer must be in the aforementioned semi-hermetic environment, as so to maintain the integrity of the procedure. Number 2. The time management device must be fully wound, or if electronic, fully charged, on fresh batteries, and fastened to the observer's hand with restraints. If the observer has no hands, it must be fastened to a part of the body where they use to facilitate the daily chores, including, but not exclusive to, the mouth. Number 3. Optional. Using restraints, ensure the observer cannot flee or avoid triggers being used. The observer's consent and willingness are helpful but not necessary. Number 4. Expose the observer to relevant trauma until they appear to become numb or reach an unresponsive stupor. This step appears to have the highest risk of failure, and has had poor long-term results in those who do not reach the state of catatonia. Number 5. At this point, remove the time management device from the observer's hand. The device must be inspected to see if it's still operational. The actual accuracy of the device doesn't appear to matter. If the device is intact and working, proceed to step 6. If the device is damaged, broken, or fails to continue its designated purpose, abort the procedure immediately and attempt to revive the individual. Number 6. Administer the sedatives or anesthetics. If all of the steps are appropriately followed, the observer may find themselves in l'hôtel raconteuse. Once there, they may seek out a moment in their life in which they have suffered a traumatic event, or an event that led to a traumatic event, and potentially change the outcome. The results are unquantifiable, as it appears that reality will mold to the changes made by the individual. Some debate exists over whether people relive false memories, meaning there is no true impact to the ritual, aside from potential treatment for trauma, which is massively overshadowed by the risk involved. In select cases, other individuals who may have been affected by the altered memory, directly or otherwise, have reported strange feelings of nostalgia, déjà vu, or vague premonitions regarding the events of the memory in question. The hotel itself appears to have some level of will, sentience, and control that it exerts over itself and the observers. It will try to encourage the observer to face the particular trauma that was used as the foundation of the ritual. The hotel is also known to make the observer considerably more uncomfortable the longer they spend inside of it. It's theorized that if a decision is not made in a prompt amount of time, 3 hours within the hotel, the real time appears to vary greatly. An individual may not wake up and remain in a catatonic stupor indefinitely. Modern trials and evidence. A well-worn document made its way across the internet, in which recent trials were attempted, but the core document itself has either faded into obscurity, been removed, or vanished altogether. Until this report, no consistent compilation of details has been released as a whole or shared with the public. The document in question details the events of a psychologist and self-described ritologist named Raphael Levant, attempting the ritual 4 times with a small group of largely uninformed volunteers, of whom half were hand-picked to be observers, and the other half facilitators. His experiments themselves were dual in purpose: to explore and confirm the validity of the ritual, and to test the boundaries of human capabilities when pushed to commit potentially dangerous actions against other human beings, under the direction of a superior authority. Raphael's proposed experiments are the closest concrete evidence we have to the ritual's legitimacy, barring the early tests from the aforementioned think tank. Only fragments of vague details from a single source were ever found, highlighting the dubious nature of the procedure and l'hôtel raconteuse itself. The following document is the result of thousands of hours of concerted efforts to A. Screen the validity of relevant information. B. Ensure linguistic background checks for consistency. C. Research all individuals involved and their roles. D. Selectively omit irrelevant or sensitive data that may put people or organizations at risk. F. Compile the appropriate vetted data for public release and consumption. The document reads as follows. There's no cure. No cure for madness, sadness, trauma, or harm. The only balm is time, and he who masters time masters the world. I was molested as a child by a family friend. I wish I could say it was only me, but my poor sister suffered too. It's hard to say which one of us handled it worse in the long run, considering she killed herself at 13. It's a terrible thing to happen to anyone. It weighs on you, weighs on me still, though I expect everyone handles their pain differently. My pain was handled by my family poorly, my therapist admirably, and narcotics sublimely. Once I believed I reached rock bottom, living a terrible life that I convinced myself I had no power over. I was invited to take part in a study. The study itself offered anywhere between $3,000 to $5,000 compensation, depending on the length and the results of the study. For the first time I could remember, I felt empowered, capable of making a change, naive as it was. I felt obligated to myself to make a change, take a step forward towards healing. I didn't know the intention of the study until I'd agreed, but I suppose if I knew, I'd have accepted without hesitation. Had I known where I would ultimately end up, I'd be in the same place I am now, running for my life. When I first met Dr. Levant, he gave me and the rest of the study group seemingly random and confusing tests. As the tests went on and questions grew more disturbing and obscure, the group shrank significantly, whether due to discomfort or failing the tests. What was something around 30 people dwindled to only 5. We then proceeded to what he referred to as the ritual stage. Everyone who had succeeded, or perhaps simply persevered, was subject to gratuitous torment. An elderly Middle Eastern woman named Sarvi was subjected to some gruesome war footage. She was the lone survivor of a drone strike on her village. A young lady named Evelyn was forced to watch staged violent gang rapes. You can probably guess what her trauma was. Every one of them was forced to witness gruesome acts that were somehow relevant to horrible things they endured. I know this because Dr. Levant made me watch, just like I was forced to watch what happened to my poor little sister by that fiend so many years ago. I only found out afterwards that Dr. Levant's experiments were mostly radical successes, aside from a middle-aged man named Henry who never entered the hotel. Everyone else not only lived, they healed. Unfortunately, in Henry's case, he took the life of one of the other experiment's facilitators, then his own. By the time I learned about the successes, it was too late. I was bound to complete the experiment. Somehow, my trial, my ritual, superseded theirs. Not only did I commit the gravest of sins, but I robbed 4 people of a recovery, of the ability to heal and move on. Whatever selfishness, passion, or ignorance fueled my motivations in the end, I truly couldn't say. When my turn came to sit in that chair, I found a second person fastened behind me. I didn't know who or why until I found myself in that sterile hellscape of a hotel. In contrast to what others had told me to expect, I wasn't alone in that lobby. Weeping like a child was Dr. Levant himself. The insides of the building were not what they were supposed to be, he told me. The walls were empty, void of windows. There were no lights, no paintings, no furniture. He knew something was wrong. Dr. Levant was filled with dread and was clearly apprehensive about approaching any door. "Lucky for us," he told me. some of our memories had to retain their individuality. It turned out that the doctor had some skeletons in his own closet. I knew that because I rattled the bones and was shaken to my very core. The first story was a horrific mash of my first day in 3rd grade, in which I wet myself and my teacher spanked me in front of the class, and something else. Something I didn't recognize. It was clear that Levant did, as he slammed the door faster than I could assess the environment. The good doctor began to run down the halls, as if he was derangedly scouring for a particular memory that he knew wouldn't be there. I was abandoned, left to wade through the mess he left me in. After what my watch told me was an hour, the hotel began to resist. Doors flung open as I walked by, and gusty winds blew from the portals, as if desperately trying to suck me into a memory. From what I saw, each memory was more warped and terrible than the last. Having lost Dr. Levant, I was forced to make my way through the distorted and melded scenes of chaotic trauma. My fear grew as I was unable to commit myself to any entrance. Slowly, my options dwindled, bit by bit. The horrors I've faced in my life all pale in comparison to mere glimpses of twisted hotel corridors, occupied only by pain and anguish. The hotel's toll began to sink in. Constant, forlorn, and piercing howls echoed the halls. The memories of Dr. Levant began to become my own. I felt them, knew them. My sense of self began to slip away, and reality became true torture. How long was I there? Was Dr. Levant still inside too? Am I actually him? And have I been him all along? That was when my maddening musings were abruptly halted. A memory, one I knew was not mine at all, appeared to be at the end of the hallway. I felt Dr. Levant's exact emotions from the moment. The terror. The agony. I spectated for a few minutes, bearing witness to what at first looked like a group of children playing innocently. Upon further realization, it was Dr. Levant as a small child, no older than 6, being gruesomely tortured by the other children. The streets and buildings looked old, and many people passed by, ignoring his cries as they burned his flesh and mutilated his genitals. They howled and screamed in some foreign language that I couldn't recognize. Finally, I overcame my hesitance and stepped through the doorway. I just wanted out, you see. I wanted out of the hotel, out of the experiment. I wanted it all gone, and for no one to experience the mind-breaking meta-reality that his transient space had borne. As I stepped through the portal, the hotel's fading walls and cacophonous wails finally released me. The children ceased the torment and looked at me. At first, they seemed uncertain, perplexed. They yelled to me in their unrecognizable tongue. I didn't know their words, but I knew what they were saying. They wanted me to fuck off. First, I grabbed the biggest child by the neck and began to ram my fist into his face, over and over. Once I started, I couldn't stop. They began to scream, and some tried to flee. I grabbed a young girl's golden curls and pulled her back, kicking in a kneecap. She screamed as she crumbled to the ground like a slinky. At this point, passers-by began to finally take notice as the other children fled. People were shouting behind me, but I knew I'd end this memory, end the trauma. It was the only way back to reality, right? I stepped forward to the whimpering and terrified child, the boy who would have been a doctor. Would have, if I hadn't stomped on his small and fragile throat, ending his lifelong struggle before it could even take root. When I woke, I found myself in a dark complex, hardly recognizable from the lab that hosted the malign experiments. Since that time, that stay in that terrible place, I've been a man unhinged. hiding from the truths that mankind should never pursue. I only pray that my words serve as a testament to what life and pain should and shouldn't be. It's important to note that, much like all other details pertaining to the hotel, nothing in this document can appropriately be corroborated. As such, there's no evidence that a Dr. Raphael Laviette ever existed or even worked in the Western world. In closing, a cure for the ails of a tortured spirit would be a holy grail, a universally sought panacea, if it were true. But even so, would such a price be worth paying? That remains to be seen. Footnotes. 1. The observer claimed to have been overcome by discomfort and uneasiness, as though the place itself was alive and did not want him there. It encouraged any and all attempts to leave, and appeared to distort, make disquieting noises, and cause hallucinations the longer one stayed. The latter most appeared to become distinctly terrifying. 2. The moment's witness before a memory was ultimately chosen, a scene of significant abuse at the hands of his father, being scolded by his aunt for having wet the bed as a child, and being ridiculed in school. 3. There is no existing record or evidence of Jacques having lost an eye, or suffering any significant mutilation during the Normandy massacre. 4. Due to excessive overdose of sedatives, laudanum has only successfully been used in one known case. 5. The use of digital watches has proven unreliable in at least 3 cases. 6. Subjects who have undergone the excessive traumatic exposure but not reached a state of catatonia have an increased risk of developing mental health disorders and attempting suicide by 150% and 600% respectively, compared to the North American average. 7. In several cases, individuals have failed to regain consciousness or awareness of their situation. They end up trapped in a permanent vegetative state until their ultimate demise. 8. Individuals have reported that the time management device that they find themselves with inside the hotel proceeds towards the 3-hour mark. Doors begin to gradually disappear, leaving naught but blank yellow walls behind. 9. Similar to the 1961 Milgram experiment. Overgrowth by Afi Bacchus, 192,000. I fear the hulking giant that waits just outside my home. I'm too afraid to even look up at him at his full size. He stands 2, maybe 3 stories tall, silently watching me, his silhouette a pitch-black void against the starry night sky. At any moment he could rip through the flimsy shelter I call home like a dull knife through skin. So why doesn't he? Why doesn't he get it over with already, instead of staring me down? Because he's waiting for me to go outside so he can crush me and put me out of my misery. Giving in to him seems more and more appealing as time goes by. Because as much as he scares me, there are more of them out there. A lot more. Some smaller, some even bigger. They're all around you, too. And you know they are. I don't know how you can even ignore them. They're everywhere. If you look out your window right now, you can probably see one, if you're lucky. Dozens of them if you're unlucky. You might even have a few lining your driveway. You might even have a tire swing hanging out of one of their branches. My name is Dr. Adam Collier, and I'm afraid of trees. You may think it's funny or unusual, but I promise you by the time I'm done telling you my story, you will fear them as much as I do.
You'll have to forgive me for any pauses or slip-ups you may hear in this recording. I'm trying as best as I can to recount everything in one take, with as much detail as possible. As I said, I am a doctor, specifically of chemical engineering. I'm a research and development technician for the Eleuthera Company in Silverdale, DE. My team and I are responsible for developing and testing prototypical chemicals for all sorts of things, really. I suppose the NDA doesn't matter anymore. I was working on synthesizing a form of carbonic anhydrase to offset carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. But even the best test results out of all of my trials required L-aspartate, fatty acids, uracil, L-arginine, and, force of habit. I'll try to refrain from using too much technical jargon from here on out. What I meant to say is that, after a series of failures, the closest thing I could come up with still required too much to be feasible. I asked my new assistant, Dr. Anna Nemmers, to contain and dispose of the chemical, as I had deemed it a failure. But unknown to me at the time, she continued to perform tests with it. She theorized that the desired reaction could occur if the compound was introduced to isoenzymes if she provided the compound with organic plant matter to consume. She took some of the byproduct of my test and made them into a mixture of her own. She put some of that mixture onto a fern she kept on her desk, completely against protocol and off the record. She told me all this later after her own tests had failed to produce anything. Let's just say that they had failed as well. Not only did she break a dozen rules, but she also failed to create anything that could even be considered close to a success for our purposes. Looking back now, I should have fired her. She did show me something entirely unexpected and deeply interesting. The chemical had not eaten away at her fern, like she had expected. In fact, the fern that she claimed was almost dead had sprouted new leaves. Quite a few, actually. At the risk of being penalized for my own assistant's actions, I hesitantly reported this to my superiors. Instead of punishing me, they encouraged me to perform more tests. They saw potential for this as a new fertilizer. From that point on, things moved quickly. Our entire team ran more tests on the original compound I had made. It turns out the chemical was more than just a decent fertilizer. We saw a 2% increase in the rate of construction of plant cells. Once my team published our findings, funding started flooding in from all over. Government agencies, farming corporations, and agrochemical powerhouses were all chomping at the bit. Our findings could impact food shortages or help places that couldn't regularly grow crops. It wasn't too much of a stretch to say that our research could have solved world hunger. With all the funding and more than enough manpower thrown at this, we pressed on to the prototype development phase. Everything seemed fine. There were no issues and no downsides. We further engineered the chemical to make the affected plants drought and frost resistant as well. We even devised a means of controlled distribution. 2 dizzying months later, we conducted the first tests on outdoor crops. Tests proceeded admirably, but this latest batch grew a little too fast. And more concerning, our control crops, which had been untouched by the chemical, also showed accelerated growth. We determined that the test plants themselves were producing their own version of the chemical, which must have spread to the control crops by being carried on the wind. Or perhaps it had penetrated deep into the soil, or maybe some bees had carried it across fields. We weren't exactly sure. Regardless of how it had reached them, leaves and stems on all plants in both testing plots were growing 5 to 10% faster at a cellular level. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the test and control crops that were affected. 2 days later, we noticed that the forest surrounding the test fields had grown 50 yards closer. That's when we knew we had a problem on our hands. Hazmat was called in to do a cleanup. They burned down all plant life and salted the soil 200 yards into the surrounding forest. They also burned and salted the test control crops as well. While it was an embarrassing mistake, we were relieved that it was successfully contained. Our relief only lasted a few days. The forest was back to where it was originally in just 2 days. This extreme rate of growth made no sense, and to make matters worse, it wasn't contained. There was evidence that it had spread even further than the woods. Faster growth meant more dispersal of plant matter, which potentially meant more plants were getting tainted with the chemical. Hazmat was called in again, but this time the damage was too widespread. Within days, plants all around the Brandmar County showed signs of hyperactive growth. On my morning drive to work, the same blind turn that I had taken dozens of times before was blocked by a giant branch that would have surely killed me if I had not stopped in time. The branch wasn't there the day before. I'm sure of it. The next day the road was closed. In just a few short days there were reports of major roads being swallowed up by greenery as far as 15 miles from our testing site. And it was spreading. But we still didn't know how. We think the wind had picked up and the pollen or leaves or seeds of tainted plants were carried all over the state, maybe even further. The Eleuthera company called in an emergency response force the size of a small army. They burnt and salted as much greenery as they could, not leaving anything to chance. Hundreds of trained professionals managed a controlled fire. The company's ties to the outbreak still hadn't reached the public. But when the massive cloud of smoke blocked out the sun, reporters came to the largest chemical company in the tri-state area for answers, and that was Eleuthera. Some news outlets claimed that the extreme growth was the result of a bioweapon test gone wrong, or an intentional act of domestic terrorism. Some even reported that it was a sign of the end times. Panic spread across the nation, and so did the chemical. The first reports of accelerated growth in the redwood forest on the west coast came out in just 2 short weeks. We didn't know enough about it. Nobody did. Was it the wind that was spreading the chemical? Was it the bees? Was it people? The government didn't want to make any risks. All flights and boats out of the country were shut down. The United States tried to quarantine the overgrowth. Reports of property damage flooded into news agencies. Top-heavy trees were toppling over and crushing people's homes. Tree branches were breaking in through windows and piercing walls. Apartment buildings were being torn apart by roots plunging into their foundation. I remember the first story of a direct death caused by plants, all too vividly. Brendan Waters was an elderly, bedridden man staying at the Woodford Manor nursing home. He woke up one day to find that his small room was being invaded by wiry vines. Those same vines were the thickest around his bed, where they had coiled themselves around his legs. He tried to pull them off, but they were too thick, and he was so weak he couldn't. He called for help, but the nurses were unable to get into his room. A patchwork of vines and roots had barricaded the metal door from the inside. Brendan could only weakly shout for help. Hours passed like this. We know every detail of the agony that Brendan went through, because the nurses were right on the other side of the door as he screamed about the cause of his pain for 35 excruciating hours. The vines that tied him down sprouted sharp thorns that tore into his legs as they crawled further and further up his frail body. The fire department was called in. Firefighters tried to go in through the 3rd floor window, but an immense tree completely blocked it. The same window that Brendan asked his nurse to keep open on a beautiful day was how the overgrowth got into his room in the first place. Firefighters worked in shifts to chop through the thickest surrounding the window. It was much too slow. The branches got thicker the more they chopped. Roots squeezed Brendan's chest. The firefighters cleared out the entire nursing home and went to work tearing down the wall nearest Brendan's bed. He couldn't feel his legs anymore. When they eventually opened up the hole in his room, they still had to contend with a mesh of pale roots on the other side. Brendan cried out for his family. None of them were there. By the time the firefighters finally carved through the thicket, Brendan was no longer screaming. His body had been pierced by dozens of sharp, tiny branches. There was no blood on the scene. The news reported that his face had bright green leaves growing out of it by the time the coroner arrived. That report came in about a month ago. Many, many more have suffered the same fate since. The country fully succumbed to panic. Many attempted to burn the aggressive forest down themselves. Gasoline became more useful for starting fires than it was for cars. All major roads were blocked anyway. So many people died in these amateur-controlled fires. And they died for nothing. The plants just grew back even faster. And it wasn't just people that were falling victim to the overgrowth. Greedy tree limbs grabbed power lines, causing power outages everywhere. Communications eventually went dark too. Thirsty roots pierced the water pipes and soon they went dry. The overgrowth took so much. Too many people have listened to the screams of their loved ones slowly being strangled by bright green leaves. All they could do was abandon them, or join them. People tried to retreat to the deserts, but even the desert showed more and more signs of the overgrowth. We made sure that plants treated by our chemical could be used in places where it was hard to grow crops, after all. They were drought and frost resistant too. Who knows what the death count is at now? I'm sure I don't want to know. I was shipped off to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica by the US government a few days before the borders were closed. Some of the original research team have flown out here too. We were working on modifying the original chemical, attempting to turn it into an herbicide. They even flew in Dr. Nemers too. It was clear that she was way in over her head. I should have fired her. Our team wasn't sure if the overgrowth had reached anywhere outside of North America by that point. We hoped it hadn't. But a French scientist at the United Nations flew in and confirmed what we had all feared. The overgrowth had crossed the ocean. Her and her team had traced the chemical to algae that had made its way to their shores via fish. Her wife was crushed to death by a falling tree. Her name was Julia. Disturbing questions spread throughout our makeshift research team. If fish could carry the chemical all the way from North America to Europe, how long would it be before it made its way to other continents? How long before it made its way here? These international scientists provided invaluable information on our research. We saw some debatably hopeful results, but they were coming much too slow. We were all desperately fighting the nagging fear they were much too late. But as the foremost experts on the chemical, if we couldn't figure out how to stop the overgrowth, who could? One day I overheard the guards talking about the Antarctic coast having a green shore. That wasn't there before. Climbing up the ice walls of the glaciers. The research team and I tried to ignore these reports, hoping they weren't true. We had to ignore them and focus on getting the herbicide to work as fast as possible. But hastiness is what got us into this mess in the first place. So we ignored the guards. We ignored the fact that they started carrying flamethrowers. We ignored the way their numbers gradually decreased. We ignored the green fuzz cresting over the mountainside and how it crept closer every day. We ignored the streaks of green in the snow that appeared in our footprints as we made our way from our quarters to the lab. Dr. Nemers didn't come into the lab one day, even though we couldn't afford days off. I had to ignore the thick,
teal moss that covered her like a blanket when I went to check on her in her quarters. I should have fired her. Less of my team showed up to work as days went on. They might have felt this plan wasn't going to work and decided to go out on their own terms. I had to ignore the splotchy moss that covered their quarters and how it might have meant that they didn't go willingly at all. I have to ignore all of these things and focus on my work, because if I don't... There's one thing that I can't ignore though, and it's standing about 60 feet away from me. Is it closer than it was yesterday? I first saw it as I was walking in the hall. I passed a window and saw a sharp green antenna poking out of the snow. I didn't think algae could form such a structure like that. A few hours later, I saw what I could only describe as leaves form on its ends like lopsided veins. This was surely some new kind of plant that has never existed before. It would be considered beautiful if the circumstances were different, if there was anyone besides me around to see it. But it looms out there, silently watching me, standing 2-3 stories tall, waiting for me to go outside so it can pull me out of my misery. Silently watching me, its blue-green skin a vulgar wound against the pure white snow. It waits just outside these walls, and I think it's getting closer.